Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight, for those who have 70 faces, we're on chapter 42, Juxtaposition of Mitzvot. I see Bracha got her book in the mail. That's great. So we're on page 390. And this is the third chapter about juxtaposition. We had juxtaposition of Torah portions. We had juxtaposition of verses. And now we're having juxtaposition of mitzvot. As we always say, the book only brings a few examples. And we're hoping that as we learn each of the methods, that when people do their own learning, these things will pop out at them and they'll remember the importance of these different methods. So tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. Usually I try to bring 5, 6, 7, 8 examples for each chapter that we do. But I found that 3 of the ones that we're going to do tonight really need a lot more explanation to really understand them. So we're really only going to do 3 different juxtapositions of mitzvot and go a little bit deeper than sometimes that we do, instead of trying to bring more and more examples. So the first one we're going to do is on page 393. And this, it's such an important one. And this is in Parshat Vayakel, which is the second last portion of the book of Exodus, Shemot. The background, the historical background is that Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai for 40 days receiving the Torah and the oral tradition. He came down with the first tablets, but he broke them immediately because of the golden calf. He went back up for 40 days to elicit God's compassion and forgiveness. And then God said, make 2 new tablets. And Moshe was there for another 40 days. So he was there a total of 120 days. And the portion of Vayakel begins when Moshe comes down with the second tablets, and he is about to give the instructions for building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Perhaps next week we're going to get into it because the next chapter is called Ein Mukdam V'Muchar B'Torah. There's no chronological flow of events necessarily in the Torah. Most of the time there is a chronological flow of events, but not always. Sometimes something appears in a portion of the Torah that chronologically happened before. And then we have to understand why is it put here if it happened before. So here, we've already had 3 Torah portions, really 2.5, totally dedicated to building the tabernacle. But the people never heard it. In other words, this was between God and Moshe. And now in Parshat Vayakel, Moshe is going to reveal the instructions for building the tabernacle. So the whole parsha of Vayakel and the next one, Pikudei, is all about actually building the Mishkan. So all told, there are 5 different parshas that have to do with building the tabernacle. But what we want to look at tonight is the whole parsha is about building the tabernacle, but it begins with a short passage about Shabbat. Now, this is not the first time that Shabbat has been mentioned in the Torah. But here, this is a general principle. When something is repeated many times. Each time there'll be new information that is added in the Torah. So here we hear for the first time about the idea of not lighting a fire on Shabbat. But the main question here is, why does Moshe have to begin with the law of Shabbos when the whole rest of the parsha is about building the tabernacle? So we're going to present 4 different possibilities, really according to what's called Pardes: Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. The simple literal text, the alluded to meaning, the more metaphorical, allegorical, symbolic meaning, and then the mystical meaning. And they all have to do with the juxtaposition of Shabbat and building the tabernacle. Why does Moshe have to introduce building the tabernacle with really only one of the laws of Shabbat? It's a very short passage. So this the simple literal meaning is that Moshe immediately has to make the point that even though building a tabernacle for the presence of God to dwell among the people, you could hardly imagine a greater task, a greater mission. But Moshe has to make it clear from the beginning, this does not supersede keeping Shabbat. One might think this is the greatest thing ever. It's even more important than Shabbat. So the simple literal understanding is Moshe introduces building the tabernacle with first the caveat, the warning that building the tabernacle does not supersede Shabbat. Now, what about the alluded to meaning? And this is very important because a lot of times when we're learning juxtaposition, we're learning more philosophical or mystical or spiritual reasons. But here in the Remez, we're learning one of the absolute bases of all Jewish law regarding Shabbat. And that is by having Shabbat right next to the tabernacle. And by the way, this is not the first time that in the midst of the laws of the tabernacle, Shabbat comes up. And so from this, the fact that there's a juxtaposition here, and second of all, that the word used for work in the tabernacle and work for Shabbat is the same word, malacha. And so because of this, because of the juxtaposition, and also what's called the juxtaposition of words, and malacha, the word for work on Shabbat, is the same word, and there are other words for work, but the fact that the word malacha comes up about Shabbat and the tabernacle, so from this is the basis of the oral tradition that the laws of Shabbat, meaning those things that are forbidden to do on Shabbat, are the same work, the same malacha that was used to build the tabernacle. In other words, the oral tradition gives over that there were 39 basic major types of work, of voda, really malacha, to build the tabernacle. And these exact same 39 are what are called the Av Malachot that we can't do on Shabbat. So this is learned from the juxtaposition. And really all the laws of Shabbat are dependent on this juxtaposition. So I won't go into it deeper, but again, the 39 malachas, types of work that we do not do on Shabbat, and of the 39, each one has scores of minor laws attached to it. It's not just 39 things we can't do on Shabbat. There's really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things, but they fall under the category of 39 major types of work. So that's on the level of what's called remez, alluded to. On the level of drush, so here Israel is being commanded to build a physical place, as it were, for the presence of God. And so sometimes the tabernacle, or later the temple in Jerusalem, or in our day, the synagogue, is called like we'll call it a palace in space. The Mishkan was beautiful. They say that the temple in Jerusalem was practically one of the wonders of the world. It was such not only a spiritual place, but its physical makeup was so beautiful, so conducive to spirituality. So the tabernacle, the temple, is called a sanctuary in space. And Shabbat is called a sanctuary in time, because it has to do with the seventh day. It's a time-oriented mitzvah. You can be anywhere in the world and keep Shabbat, because it's time-related. It's a temporal idea. So this idea on the spiritual level is the unity of time and space. That just like we have a physical sanctuary in space, and we create a special space, so Shabbat is a sanctuary in time. Now, on the mystical level, we're going to just take that same idea and just go one more step with it. And as we've discussed a number of times, one of the greatest revelations or discoveries of the last 100 years in science was Einstein teaching and making everyone aware what's called the time-space continuum. That until Einstein, space and time were considered completely separate, as if they had nothing to do with each other. And it was Einstein who revealed that time and space are intrinsically woven together. And so here, this is alluded to in the idea of the holiness of time and the holiness of space. Shabbos is holy time, and the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the temple, the synagogue is holy space. But here, when we take it to the mystical level, we see a unity between time and space already being alluded to in the Torah, in the juxtaposition of Shabbat and the tabernacle. Okay, so that's our first example here. And this is, like I said, this is not just a philosophical or mystical meanings come out of this kind of juxtaposition. This juxtaposition is the basis of Jewish law and Shabbat, the 39 major categories of malacha, of work that we don't do, in its juxtaposition to the work done in the tabernacle. Okay, so that was our first example for tonight. The next one is on page 396. And this comes from the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. And it says, you shall have a full and honest weight, a full and honest ephah measure, in order that your days will be prolonged on the land which Hashem your God gives you. For whoever does these things, whoever perpetrates such injustice is an abomination to God, your God. So this is one of many laws about honesty in business. Here, when we're talking about honest weight, even to this day, when you go to the store and you buy your vegetables and your fruits, so everything is weighed. That's how they know how much to charge you. In the old days, they also, with grains and nuts, everything was like weighed on the spot. We're used to getting everything in plastic bags now. But in the old days, everything was really dependent on weights and what's called honest weights. And so the Torah is telling us that anyone who tries to cheat someone else by having like illegitimate types of weights, that is considered an abomination to Hashem. So right after this mitzvah comes the repetition of what happened when Amalek came against the Jewish people right after we left Egypt. The original story is in the book of Shemot, Exodus. But here, towards the end of the Torah, in Parsha Ki Teitzei, it goes over that incident, and it's right next to this mitzvah. So based on this, so Rashi brings the tradition that if the Jewish people do not conduct themselves honestly in business, then they should worry about an enemy like Amalek coming against us. That's what Rashi says. So, and in other words, because of the juxtaposition, one is to have honest weights, and the next one is to remember what Amalek did to us. And they come right after each other. So this is an example of which there are scores of examples where mitzvahs come one next to the other. And you would say, well, what does honest weights have to do with Amalek? But the sages understood that because they are right next to each other, that there's, in a sense, a possible cause and effect kind of relationship, that dishonesty in business will lead to enemies coming against us. But I want to explain this, because this, if I just jump to the next example, there's a very deep question here. There's a very deep question, and this is not the only place where this concept that if we don't act properly, it brings our own enemies upon us. So then the obvious question is, well, then what culpability do our enemies have? In other words, if we're causing our own enemies through what's called measure for measure, or a karmic relationship, then what responsibility does the enemy have? If we're perpetuating the situation and leading to it. So the same question is asked by Maimonides about Pharaoh. In other words, Avram Avinu was told that your descendants are going to go down and they're going to become slaves for 4 generations, and they'll be oppressed, and then they will come out with great wealth. So Maimonides asked the obvious question. So if that's the destiny, or that's the prophecy already given to Avram, well, how can you blame Pharaoh? Wasn't he just fulfilling his job? So first of all, in the text, it never says to Egypt per se, and it doesn't mention how the oppression would happen, how horrible it would be, what degree. And so Maimonides explains is that Pharaoh made his own decisions. And even though it was already prophesied, who said it had to be Pharaoh and in that way and so cruel? So even though we have this idea that, let's say, Israel's not honest with weights, and it leads to a situation that we can expect enemies to come against us, that doesn't preclude the reward and punishment that our enemies might have, because this is a very dangerous proposition. In fact, I'm just thinking, I think everyone read recently the foreign minister of Russia made some very outrageous comments about like who caused the Holocaust and how it happened. And it seemed like to most of the world, as he was actually, in a sense, blaming the Jews for their own destruction, which of course promoted a lot of response around the world. But it's very connected to what we're learning here. Now there's two other examples that I'll bring. Is when the original story of when Amalek came, there's also a juxtaposition, a very strong juxtaposition. Is right before Amalek comes, the people were on our way to Mount Sinai, and we're already having lots of challenges and obstacles. And the people say, it's written in the Torah, the people say, is God among us or not? There was like a weakening of faith. The very next thing it says in the Torah is Vayavo Amalek, and Amalek came. And so again, this juxtaposition, not of mitzvot, but of verses, are teaching us because we lost our trust in God, we questioned whether God was even among us, we had doubt. And the Baal Shem Tov revealed that the name Amalek in Gematria equals 240, equals Safek, doubt. And so the verse before Amalek comes is, the people had doubt, is God among us or not? Immediately, and Amalek came. So this is another example of there is a certain level of responsibility that we also have to take. And the other one, which is really an amazing one, is where did Amalek come from? In other words, what lineage? So he came from Esav and Timnah. Timnah was Esav had relations with Timnah, and from that came Amalek. And so the sages actually asked, well, like, how did Timnah end up in such a situation that she would give birth to Amalek? So the sages say this. There's a tradition that she wanted to become part of the Jewish people. And she came to Avraham and wanted to be part of the Jewish people. And it's quite amazing because Avraham is teaching about one God. He's trying to turn on the whole world. For whatever reason, he rejected her. He pushed her away. And so it says that Timnah went and she ended up with Esav, and she ended up giving birth to Amalek. So the sages say this should teach us the cost of pushing someone away who wants to come close. So this is like an amazing teaching. It's really an amazing teaching. So here we have a number of examples where, because of the concept of a measure for measure, which is what we're going to see in like 2 chapters, we're going to learn about measure for measure because it's a type of juxtaposition. it falls in the category of juxtaposition. This cause and effect. But like I said, we have to be very, very careful with this idea, because I mean, there are a lot of jokes about it, maybe too many jokes about Jewish guilt, that we have a propensity to blame ourselves for everything. There's something very healthy about that, meaning taking responsibility and not shirking responsibility and blaming everyone else for everything. But there's also a side where it can like get out of hand, where we blame ourselves for everything when it's not necessarily called for. So there's a fine line there. And this applies to our enemies. So I'll never forget, there was a very, very, very holy Rabbi Gedalia. At one point, he was really the leader of the Breslov community in Israel. And his son was the one who set up the whole Breslov community in Tzfat. And he was like an old style Hasidic Rebbe, but he loved Baal Tshuvas. He loved people coming back to Torah. And so he befriended, or we befriended him, and many of my contemporaries had a very close relationship with him. I'll never forget, one time he came to the Moshav and he taught. And it was during the week, and I really can't remember all the details, but that day there was a terrible terrorist incident of hijacking a bus, and eventually almost everyone in the bus was killed. The army stormed the bus, but in the whole event, many people were killed. And it just happened that he came that night. And so I remember people asked Rabbi Gedalia, how do we understand this? How do we understand this? And I remember what he said. He said, certain things we don't understand. But if the Jewish people were doing what they were supposed to do, things like this wouldn't happen. So here, he kind of like balanced it. In other words, anytime that something horrible happens in Israel, and unfortunately this last month, we've had a lot of experience with many things that haven't happened in quite a while. So we can always just point the finger at our enemies. And there's a certain truth to that. But there's also the wisdom to know we also have to look at ourselves to try to understand why these things are happening. So it's a very, very subtle, difficult balance where we don't blame everything on everyone else, or we take complete responsibility for things that are not in our hand to take responsibility. If, like I say, in the last month, it's like around 18 people have been killed in just cold blood, just randomly on the streets of Israel. And so on one hand, we could say, well, what do we need to do spiritually that these things don't happen? On the other hand, it's like we're not, because there are people who are doing these terrible things. and they have to take responsibility, and we have to deal with it. So it's a very subtle and deep subject. I hope I did justice to it. Okay, the last one that we're going to do is on page 390. And this is a very, very interesting one. And this is coming from in Parshat Tetzaveh. And again, in Parshat Pikudei, a lot of verses in the Torah deal with the clothing of the Kohanim, the priests, and especially the high priest. And so there is a juxtaposition here that the sages saw, that right next to the laws about the clothing of the priests, the Kohanim, it is juxtaposed to the sacrificial offerings. And so the sages make a comment that just like the offerings on the altar brought atonement and rectification, so too the clothing of the high priest and the regular priest, the Kohanim, brings atonement for certain sins or certain acts. So, and they learned this from a juxtaposition because these two mitzvot are right next to each other. So we have a tremendous question here. How does it work that clothes can cause an atonement for sins of other people? So, I mean, it's a really important question because the sages make a statement that the clothing of the high priest, and we're going to go through them very quickly. The regular Kohanim wore 4 garments, and the Kohen Gadol wore 8. And in the Talmud, they go through all 8 clothings of the high priest and explain what they atone for. But before we do that, we have the bigger question of how does it work? How does it work that clothing becomes an atonement? So it just happens, many of you were here last week, and if you remember, when we were learning the juxtaposition of verses, there's after Adam and Chava eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, it says that they opened their eyes and realized they were naked, and they took leaves of figs and they made like a covering for themselves. And from this, one of the opinions of, well, what fruit was the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And one of the 4 opinions that we learned were figs. Why? Because there's a juxtaposition. Because they ate from the tree, and since they made the clothing from figs, we can learn from that which caused the blemish or the sin, is that what will be used to fix it up? So this is a very, very important concept to answer our question, because the first clothing came as a rectification of the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so here, in fact, in Hebrew, the root for clothing is begadim. Beged is a garment, a beged. But the sages point out that the same 3-letter root is boged, which means like a rebel. There's a better word for it than that. Someone who's disloyal, a rebel, someone who like goes against everything moral and ethical. That's a boged. And so the clothing came to fix this. Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat from the tree at that point, and they did. And we're still living with the results of it. So the original clothing came as a tikkun. And when we discuss in Torah law the idea of modesty, not just for women, for men as well. So the laws of modesty are based on really a single principle, is that by unclothing our body, we're advertising that who we are is our physicality. And by dressing modestly, we're advertising that my physical body is not the real me. It houses my soul. So the whole idea of modesty and clothing is very, very wrapped up with rectification. And however you want to say this, but you look at the Western world and you look at the trend setters, let's call it Hollywood. There, it's competition, quite literally, who can show the most flesh. That's like the name of the game. Like the more flesh that you can show, the more progressive you are, the more advanced you are, the more mature you are, whatever. This goes very, very against the Jewish idea of the purpose of clothing and the idea of modesty. So this also goes, I'm just going to add one other thing here, is one of the most important concepts in Kabbalah and Chassidut is what's called enclothement. Hit lab shut. Hit lab shut means enclothement. So obviously it has to do with clothing, but it has to do with much, much more than that. That the world enclothes God. The body enclothes the soul. Physicality enclothes spirituality. Scientifically, matter enclothes energy. These are all in the category of hit lab shut. One world encloses an upper world. Each of the sfirot enclose all the other sfirot. This is what's called inter-inclusion and hit lab shut. So this is connected with the clothing of the Kohanim, because the Torah really takes quite a long time to describe in tremendous detail how these clothes were made and how they were worn and their colors and how they were woven and everything. So before we get into the 8 clothings and what they atone for, what isn't mentioned here is that on the shoulders of the high priest, there were 2 stones. They were called shoham stones. And from the stones hang a chain. And on the chain was the breastplate with the 12 stones and the 12 names of the 12 tribes. But also on the shoulder stone were engraved, on one shoulder were 6 of the tribes, and the other shoulder was the other 6 of the tribes. And so this is one of the best examples of why the Torah is making a big deal of the clothing, because the Kohanim their purpose was a dual purpose. On one hand, they were God's representative to the people. On the other hand, they were the people's representative to God. They were both at the same time, depending on the circumstances. And so the symbolism of these two shoulder stones was the expression that a person is carrying everyone on their shoulders. So here, the Kohen Gadol, because the names of the tribes are written and he's carrying them on his shoulders, it's quite literal that the clothing is trying to teach us how the Kohen Gadol, and now because we don't have a temple and we don't have the service of the temple, so in a certain way, everyone becomes a Kohen. Israel is supposed to be a nation of Kohanim. That's what God told us before we received the Torah at Sinai. And so here, each person, in a sense, is carrying the weight of the whole world on their shoulders. Secondly, the breastplate is right over the heart. So it's the same teaching here. And again, you have the 12 precious stones with the names of the tribes engraved in them. And the same teaching is that our hearts have to be wide enough to encompass the whole world. So having said that, and we have a little bit of what's called a taste of the role of clothing. And I'm just going to add here is that there's an expression, clothes make the person. On the other hand, you have an expression, don't judge a book by its cover. I can tell you, though, from someone who has published a lot of books, everyone judges the book by its cover. That is, I don't care what the saying says. The saying is a good saying, that we shouldn't draw conclusions. You know, we shouldn't judge people from first appearances, but we do. Everyone does. And so this idea that clothing makes the person, the Torah is actually putting this out. And the best example is Shabbat. One of the really laws of Shabbat, it's like a custom, but it's really in the halacha. We don't wear the same clothes on Shabbat that we wear during the week. Because if we did, there would be something missing. In other words, the clothes of Shabbat make us feel different. They uplift us. And we're actually told that the clothes of a holiday is an even like its own unique level. The holiday clothes are like super special. Super special. So again, we always have these opposites that we're trying to balance between not judging people by their outside appearance. On the other hand, what we want to broadcast to the world, that depends on us. If we want to dress like a schlepper, we can't blame other people for looking at us like a schlepper. And that's, again, if we go back to modesty, so in the Western world, like I say, the so-called trend makers, that's the message that they're sending to the world about themselves, is I want you to look at me, I want you to look at my body. That's what I'm advertising to the world. So that's not exactly our way. It doesn't mean that someone is necessarily a bad person or an evil person. We're just trying to point out a difference of attitude about clothing, attitude about what we are advertising to the world. Okay, so those who want to follow, it's on page 391. So we're going to go through quickly the 8 clothing of the high priest and what the sages say it atones for. So the first is a tunic, a ketonet. So this is connected to the coat of many colors, as it's called, that the brothers, when they sold Joseph, so they dipped his tunic in the blood of a goat, and they came back to their father and said, "This is what we found." And for 22 years, his father assumed that a wild animal had killed his son. And so this tunic was, for the high priest, was to fix the unnecessarily spilling of blood. The trousers, what we call underwear. So this, of course, came to fix immorality. The turban, they wore, we have a kippah now, but one of the dressings was like a turban, and it was called a mitznefet. And this came to atone for arrogance, because Rav Chanina in the Talmud says, "Let something worn high in the head come to atone for haughtiness." So this turban came to atone for arrogance, haughtiness, undue pride. Then there was a sash, what we would, let's say, call like a belt of material called an avnet. And it actually was put close to the heart, not down like where we usually wear a belt, but it was worn higher, right under the heart. And this came to fix unrectified thoughts of the heart, or we'll call it unrectified emotions. So this is interesting that this sash was very long. In other words, they put it around and around and around. So the Gemara asks, well, how long was it supposed to be? 32 amot. An amma is from the elbow to the finger. Usually we call it about 1.5 feet. So this belt was like 50 feet long, but they just wore it around themselves many, many times. And this is the source. Many Hasidic groups, before they pray, they have it's called a gartel. It's like a cloth, not a leather belt, like a cloth belt that they put around themselves, very much like the Kohanim did, to separate, in a sense, from the upper soul and the lower soul. Okay, the next is the breastplate. We talked about that a little bit, worn on the heart. And it was actually called Choshen HaMishpat, the breastplate of judgment. And so this came to atone for immoral or unrectified judgments by individuals, by courts, by judges. Then there was an apron-like clothing. And this was to rectify and atone for idolatry. Because Hosea, one of the prophets, there's a verse in Hosea that was juxtaposed talking about this ephod, and the next verse is talking about idol worship. And because of that juxtaposition, the sages said that this apron came to atone for evil speech, idolatry. Then there was a robe called the me'il. This was a long robe that went all the ways down to the ground. And on the me'il of the Kohen Gadol, there's two different versions. There were 72 pomegranates and 72 bells, like real bells. And it says that when the Kohen Gadol would walk around, these bells would ring. The difference of opinion was, were there really 144? Because the Torah says, Pamon v'rimon, Pamon v'rimon, Pamon v'rimon. Was there a pomegranate and then a bell, and then a pomegranate and a bell? Or some say that the bells were inside of the pomegranates. Either way, the bells made a sound. And so the sages say that this came to atone for lashon hara, for evil speech. And then the last one is called the head plate. This is only the Kohen Gadol wrote it. And it said on it, Kadosh Lashem, holy for God. And this was similar to the turban, that it was to atone for brazenness. The turban was more like arrogance, but this is like even worse. This is brazenness, real chutzpah. The first one's like minor chutzpah. This is like major chutzpah, brazenness. Okay, so those are the 8 things, but to tie this together is, we could still ask, well, okay, we've made these associations. So how does it work? How do these clothings atone for? And the answer really is consciousness. In other words, it's really dependent, not somewhat, most of that those wearing these garments had in mind that this is the purpose of the garment. And then the garment has the power to atone. So in other words, if the Kohen Gadol was wearing these shoulder stones with all of Israel on his shoulder, but he never thought about that. That wasn't his kavanah, that's not his intent. Then there's a question if any atonement is happening. But when there's intent, so these clothing, and this, we're going to broaden it. We talked about enclothement as a bigger concept. So in other words, if we enclothe our actions and our speech and our thoughts with holy intentions, then this type of atonement works. So that's a very, very important idea. It's the clothing has to intone the kavana behind it. And I'll just end, and this is much too big of a subject to introduce at the end, but I'm just going to mention it. There are many, many examples in the prophets where God comes and tells the prophet to do what we'll call a symbolic act. And the question, like one time, God came to Jeremiah, and said, go to the leaders of the people and take a earthen jar and break it in front of them and say to them, just like this earthen vessel is broken, if you don't change your ways, the temple will be broken. So this, in other words, this was a symbolic act, but it had to have intent behind it. And then the act becomes the enclosement for the intent. And there are many, many different times where God tells a prophet to do something very symbolic. Sometimes no one even knew about it other than the prophet. And the question is, well, why did God command them to do it? Because the idea needed enclosement. And one of the ones that we didn't mention is vessels enclose light. The body enclosed the soul. The world enclosed God. Physicality enclosed spirituality. And here, the clothing of the Kohanim enclosed an intent that God wanted, that the people wearing these clothing were like walking symbols of rectification, atonement, and as messengers between God and the people and God. So I'll end with a blessing that we learn to enclose our thoughts, our speech, and our action in the right way, to advertise to other people what we want to give over about ourselves, what we want to plant in the world, and that we all have beautiful, beautiful clothing.